Just moments ago, former U.S. President Donald Trump publicly declared that nuclear talks with Iran are very good and progressing, even as the world stands on a geopolitical knife's edge where military confrontation and diplomacy are colliding in real time. In a recent Washington meeting with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, Trump insisted he is pushing talks with Tehran forward while still warning that if Iran does not make a deal, consequences are very steep. These were not casual words. They came as part of a concerted diplomatic push that saw extended negotiations in Oman between U.S. envoys and Iranian officials, described by both sides as a good start, but far from a final agreement. This moment is explosive because the official language of the talks masks the deeper realities on the ground. Iran's top negotiators in Muscat have emphasized that these discussions are focused strictly on Tehran's civilian nuclear program, explicitly excluding ballistic missiles, regional proxy conduct, and human rights issues, topics Washington and Israel want included. Tehran remains adamant about retaining some level of uranium enrichment as a sovereign right, even as Trump and his team demand zero nuclear weapons capability, missile restrictions, and limits on support for groups like Hamas and Hezbollah. These competing red lines make the current talks deeply unstable. At the same time that Trump is publicly touting very good discussions, the U.S. military posture in the Middle East has shifted dramatically. The Pentagon has ordered a second aircraft carrier strike group to prepare for possible deployment to the region, a significant escalation in readiness that underscores how close tensions are to boiling over. The USS Abraham Lincoln is already deployed, and officials have signaled that another carrier, likely the USS George H.W. Bush, could join in the near future. That move would dramatically expand U.S. offensive and defensive options from airstrikes to rapid force projection in the event negotiations collapse. This dual-track, diplomatic talks worth celebrating and simultaneous military buildup tells you everything about how fragile this situation is. Trump himself has openly said that if a deal is not reached, the U.S. must do something very tough, leaving open the door to strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities or leadership targets. He even warned that Iran's supreme leader should be very worried as forces amass, language that underscores just how thin the line between negotiation and confrontation has become. And yet, despite this high-stakes stance, Iran has not backed down on core demands. Tehran continues to enrich uranium up to 60% purity, levels that significantly shorten the technical path to weapons capability relative to the limits set under the 2015 nuclear deal, and it has repeatedly rejected halting or reversing that enrichment without lifting international sanctions first. Iranian officials have maintained that any deal must respect their right to peaceful nuclear technology, and have resisted broader U.S. demands that would touch on missiles or regional conduct. Both sides are laboratory testing the same dangerous theory, that they can pursue diplomacy without satisfying the other's core security demands. Trump's administration emphasizes sanctions relief and strict non-proliferation, while Iran emphasizes economic relief and retention of enrichment capacity. That friction point, unresolved for years, re-emerged now against a backdrop of renewed sanctions, mutual distrust, military mobilization, and global energy volatility. Every word Trump utters about good talks is paired with a warning about military consequences. Israel, which remains skeptical about the feasibility of diplomacy under these terms, has publicly stressed that Tehran's ballistic missiles must be addressed in any final agreement, a demand Iran has rejected in current discourse. That leaves a glaring strategic gap: diplomacy praising incremental progress and military forces postured to act if that progress collapses. This is not abstract diplomacy. This is a moment where military carriers and negotiations rooms are moving in opposite directions at the same time, where words of progress on peace are happening alongside operational planning for potential attacks, and where optimism sits beside urgent warnings. The stakes are not distant geopolitical abstractions, they are high-stakes choices that could either avert war or bring the Middle East back into a phase of kinetic conflict. And right now, with Trump saying talks are very good, and war still very much looming, the world is watching a diplomatic tightrope walk that could break at any moment. The explosive diplomatic moment we see unfolding in early 2026, with Donald Trump calling U.S. Iran nuclear talks very good, even as the possibility of war looms, did not emerge spontaneously. It grew out of years of strategic confrontation, broken agreements, and repeated cycles of escalation that have narrowed diplomatic space and made compromise far harder. The crisis traces back most clearly to May 8, 2018, when when the United States unilaterally withdrew from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action JCPOA, a decades-in-the-making deal originally signed on July 14, 2015, that capped Iran's enrichment and imposed stringent inspection requirements. That withdrawal instantly reimposed sanctions, triggered Tehran's gradual rollback of nuclear limits, and set in motion a sequence of mistrust and confrontation that has only intensified. In the years following the U.S. exit, Iran progressively increased enrichment levels, ultimately reaching up to 60% purity, levels alarmingly close to weapons grade and far above the original 67% cap the JCPOA mandated. This enrichment buildup was confirmed repeatedly by International Atomic Energy Agency reporting, and remains one of the central sticking points in today's talks. That sequence of decisions, withdrawal, sanctions, and Iran's step-by-step enrichment escalation fundamentally altered the dynamics. Tehran began to see nuclear constraints not as temporary pauses but as strategic vulnerabilities, a pattern that has shaped its strategy in negotiations ever since. By 2025, enrichment had significantly expanded, and negotiations in Rome and Oman that year revealed deep schisms. Washington demanded strict uranium limits and potentially reversal, while Tehran refused to suspend enrichment entirely, calling such demands unrealistic and untenable without guarantees the U.S. would not again walk away from any deal. Those deep divisions became apparent partly because both sides entered talks with competing core red lines. Washington insisted on ending or severely curtailing enrichment. Iran insisted on retaining enrichment rights and vehemently resisted linking the nuclear file to missile programs or support for regional proxies. That refusal to budge on core elements has echoed into current negotiations. Fast forward to early February 2026. Diplomatic channels have reopened, but they are doing so in a far more constrained environment than a decade ago. Meetings scheduled for early February in Oman's capital Muscat, involving senior U.S. envoys such as Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi, are billed as efforts to avert a broader crisis that could spill into warfare. These talks are described by Tehran and Muscat as a good start, but the substance remains limited. Both sides have agreed to focus principally on nuclear issues, leaving larger demands like ballistic missile curbs and regional behavior on the table, but not on the agenda. Tehran's consistent insistence that its missile capabilities are a red line confirms that certain core demands from Washington are being explicitly excluded from negotiation. The origins of that red line framing go deep. Since at least the first round of renewed talks in April 2025, Iran's leadership has made clear that it views both nuclear enrichment capability and its defensive systems as sovereign necessities, non-negotiables. That stance was reinforced publicly during the recent 47th anniversary of the Islamic Revolution commemorations, where senior Tehran advisors declared ballistic missile development off-limits to negotiation, even as nuclear discussions proceed in Oman. That bifurcation, negotiable nuclear limits vs. non-negotiable missile and defense programs, is not simply a quirk of diplomatic process. It is a strategic choice shaped by decades of mistrust, including memories of previous U.S. military actions such as the June 2025 strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities that marked the first direct U.S. military intervention against Tehran's nuclear infrastructure. These events reinforced Tehran's belief that hard military power, not diplomacy, sets the final terms, leading Iranian policymakers to embed deterrence in both nuclear capability and defensive reach. Today's negotiations exist in the shadow of that strategic calculus. A calculus built on broken agreements, reciprocal distrust, and hardened security postures. Complicating matters further, regional powers such as Israel have publicly lobbied the United States to expand negotiations to include missiles, proxy networks, and human rights concerns, incorporating broader security dimensions that Tehran refuses to entertain. Washington itself has signaled a willingness to tolerate limited enrichment under tightly controlled conditions, a potential shift from pre-2018 expectations, but without consensus on additional constraints. Observers see this fracturing of expectations as a structural flaw in current talks. Each side enters with differing assumptions about what must be surrendered and what is inviolable. What the public often isn't told is that these are not just negotiations over isolated technical issues. They are negotiations conditioned by years of strategic escalation, mutual recrimination, and diverging definitions of core national interests. The unresolved historical antagonism is what makes today's talks dangerously fragile. The past is not merely context, it is the very framework within which every decision and every concession must be interpreted. The human and economic consequences of this nuclear standoff are no longer abstract, they are concrete, immediate, and escalating with every headline. Across the Middle East, populations are living under a persistent state of uncertainty. In Israel, for example, civil defense drills have become routine, with sirens tested multiple times per week in communities within range of Iranian missiles. Schools and hospitals have adapted to contingency planning, moving classes into reinforced shelters and keeping emergency medical supplies on standby. Families report anxiety levels rising, particularly in southern districts like Ashkelon and Sderot, where past missile attacks in 2024 left both physical and psychological scars. Local businesses are struggling to maintain normal operations under the constant threat of escalation, and even routine deliveries are rerouted or delayed due to precautionary alerts. This is not distant war, this is daily life under the shadow of potential conflict in Iran. The economic fallout is equally stark but operates on a different axis. Years of intermittent sanctions, compounded by heightened diplomatic uncertainty in 2026, continue to depress the rial and push inflation into double digits. Essential imports, including pharmaceuticals and medical equipment, are increasingly difficult to obtain, placing hospitals under extreme pressure. Reports from Tehran hospitals indicate that routine surgeries and advanced medical procedures have been delayed, not because of lack of staff, but because key supplies are simply unavailable. Small business owners face skyrocketing operational costs as international banking channels remain restricted and insurance for goods passing through the Strait of Hormuz carries extreme premiums due to the ongoing risk of conflict. Every spike in diplomatic tension, every news headline about missile rebuilds, directly translates into higher commodity prices and reduced liquidity for ordinary citizens. The United States and its allies are not immune to these pressures. Oil markets remain hyper-sensitive. Brent crude has spiked above $95 per barrel in early February 2026, reacting to the dual reality of nuclear talks and visible Iranian missile reconstruction. Shipping insurance premiums for Gulf transit routes remain at a historical high, and global energy traders are factoring in risk scenarios where escalation could disrupt nearly a fifth of worldwide oil exports. These price shifts affect everything from airline tickets to household energy bills, squeezing both business and consumer budgets. Corporations with supply chains through the Middle East are increasingly hedging against geopolitical risk, slowing shipments and rerouting goods, all of which feeds into inflationary pressures in Europe, North America, and Asia. The human stories behind these numbers are stark. In southern Israel, parents report sleeping in shifts to monitor alerts, while in Tehran, hospital nurses recount repeated nights of improvisation due to lack of medical consumables. In Gulf states, small business owners are making hard choices between paying rising security premiums and maintaining workforce salaries, leading to layoffs or delayed investment in expansion. Even in countries not directly on the front line, commodity price spikes, energy cost increases, and defense spending adjustments are felt in ordinary households, a reminder that the consequences of nuclear brinkmanship ripple far beyond the region itself. Employment is also under strain. Iran's sanctioned economy cannot attract foreign investment at scale, while domestic businesses struggle to expand under currency volatility. Israel's high-tech and defense industries, meanwhile, are forced to prioritize security projects over commercial innovation, diverting talent and resources from civilian growth sectors. The psychological effect of sustained high alert across multiple populations is intensifying. Markets react faster than policymakers, citizens live in persistent uncertainty, and governments are pressured to act decisively while managing domestic backlash. The combined impact is a growing fracture in both confidence and economic stability. Citizens, employees, and small business owners see tangible consequences of decisions made thousands of miles away in negotiation rooms or on military planning maps. Diplomatic progress, no matter how very good it might seem publicly, has yet to translate into relief for the people actually living under the shadow of potential conflict. That gap between optimistic statements and harsh realities intensifies stress, erodes public trust, and creates conditions where a single misstep could escalate tension far beyond what any negotiator anticipated. And through it all, the officials responsible, from Tehran's nuclear negotiators to Trump's diplomatic team, remain in positions of authority, shaping a reality in which every day of negotiation or delay has a direct human cost. Responsibility for the precarious state of U.S. Iran relations in early 2026 is not abstract. It rests on a series of decisions by leaders in Tehran, Washington, and allied capitals. each shaping the environment in which diplomacy and potential conflict now coexist. Iran's leadership has repeatedly drawn a hard line on nuclear and missile capabilities. Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, in statements during the February 2026 anniversary commemorations of the Islamic Revolution, emphasized that ballistic missile development is non-negotiable and framed it as essential for national defense against external threats. By publicly refusing to link missiles to ongoing nuclear talks, Tehran has guaranteed that any agreement will be partial, leaving the core deterrent capacity intact. This stance directly complicates Trump's current claims that negotiations are very good, highlighting the gap between public optimism and operational reality. On the U.S. side, responsibility is equally layered. The 2018 withdrawal from the JCPOA under the Trump administration fundamentally altered the negotiating landscape, stripping away international enforcement mechanisms that had limited Iran's enrichment capacity. Critics have repeatedly pointed out that leaving without securing enforceable missile constraints created a structural problem. The United States removed leverage while leaving Iran with the tools to accelerate uranium enrichment, rebuild centrifuge infrastructure, and maintain regional proxy influence. Current negotiations are attempting to repair what years of unilateral action fractured, but every step forward remains shadowed by the political decision to prioritize short-term pressure over long-term compliance guarantees. European allies are not without accountability. In 2025, Germany, France, and the UK attempted to maintain the instrument in support of trade exchanges, in steps to preserve limited economic access for Iran under sanctions. While the mechanism kept trade channels open, enforcement weaknesses and reliance on U.S. sanction waivers rendered it only partially effective. By failing to provide independent enforcement or tangible incentives, European governments effectively left Iran with the perception that adherence to nuclear limits was negotiable, a perception that continues to influence Tehran's negotiating strategy in 2026. Israel, as a regional actor with a direct security stake, also shapes the accountability landscape. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who has consistently pushed for negotiations to include Iran's missile program, its regional proxy networks, and stricter verification protocols. Tehran's refusal to engage on these points has been publicly amplified by Israeli intelligence reports, which highlight ongoing missile site reconstruction and unmanned aerial vehicle testing. This exposes the gap between Washington's public optimism and the technical reality on the ground. While negotiations continue, Iran is actively preparing for scenarios where diplomacy fails. What makes this accountability crisis especially dangerous is the mismatch between public messaging and operational reality. Trump's team insists that talks are very good. Yet the Pentagon is simultaneously mobilizing a second aircraft carrier strike group to the Gulf, with the USS Abraham Lincoln already deployed and the USS George H.W. Bush on standby. Every diplomatic statement claiming progress is mirrored by military preparation that signals the opposite: readiness for escalation. That duality creates enormous risk because it invites miscalculation. Tehran may interpret military posturing as prelude to strikes, while Washington's allies may perceive any Iranian movement as proof talks are failing, further escalating tension. Accountability extends beyond high-level decision makers to the systems themselves. The IAEA's monitoring and verification architecture, weakened after 2018, cannot provide complete real-time data on uranium enrichment or nuclear facility modifications. Without robust verification, even minor Iranian activity can trigger alarms that escalate conflict perception. Every day that inspections are limited and enrichment continues, leaders on both sides share responsibility for increasing the stakes. The public sees hopeful statements about negotiation. The professionals on the ground see centrifuge installations, missile testing, and regional proxy mobilization. Ultimately, the responsibility for this tension is cumulative. Tehran's refusal to discuss missiles, Washington's past withdrawal from the JCPOA, European enforcement gaps, Israeli pressure for broader constraints, and systemic inspection limitations all converge. Each decision, each omission, and each political calculation has layered the crisis we now see. Diplomacy, optimism, and rhetoric may paint a hopeful narrative, but the reality remains that the underlying strategic and operational vulnerabilities are unresolved, and failure to acknowledge these gaps leaves the world one misstep away from escalation. The fallout of the current U.S. Iran nuclear standoff extends far beyond negotiations, inspections, and military posturing. The trajectory we are witnessing in February 2026 is not a distant theoretical risk, it is a looming crisis with long-term consequences that threaten to reshape the Middle East global energy markets, and the psychological resilience of populations across multiple continents. If diplomacy falters, the immediate effects will be severe. Oil supply disruptions through the Strait of Hormuz, which carries nearly 20% of global crude, could send prices surging well above $100 per barrel. Shipping insurance premiums are already at historical highs, and insurers have begun conditioning coverage on the rapid escalation or de-escalation of tensions, creating cascading costs for trade-dependent economies from Asia to Europe. That economic pressure is not abstract. It will directly hit households through increased fuel costs, higher transportation fees, and inflation in imported goods. The human consequences of continued tension are equally stark. In Iran, shortages of medical supplies caused by continued sanctions and banking restrictions have forced hospitals to postpone critical procedures and ration care. In southern Israel, civil defense alerts continue multiple times a week, forcing parents to sleep in shifts and schools to operate under reinforced shelter protocols. Across the Gulf, small businesses are facing insolvency as security costs, shipping premiums, and energy price spikes eat into margins, leading to layoffs and delayed salaries. In both the short and medium term, populations are experiencing psychological stress at unprecedented levels, living in a persistent state of near conflict. This stress is compounded by the fact that, despite public statements of good progress, in talks on the ground realities, missile testing, uranium enrichment, and forward military deployments continue unabated, creating a stark contrast between optimism in rhetoric and danger in action. Long-term consequences could be catastrophic if current patterns persist. Should Iran maintain or accelerate uranium enrichment beyond 60%, even while talks continue, the technical breakout timeline for a potential nuclear weapon shrinks to mere months. Simultaneously, regional arms races are likely to intensify. Israel has already accelerated air defense funding and missile interception capabilities. Gulf states continue procuring advanced systems from Europe and the U.S. Every escalation in military capability increases the risk of miscalculation or accidental conflict, creating a feedback loop that no single negotiation can easily break. Observers warn that, without enforceable inspections and verifiable limits, the Middle East could enter a permanent near-war equilibrium where high alert and economic disruption become routine, rather than exceptional. Education and healthcare systems are also at risk. In Iran, economic sanctions and inflation already threaten access to quality schooling, and healthcare delivery remains constrained. Israel continues to allocate resources heavily towards civil defense, diverting funding from social programs and innovation initiatives. Across the region, rising defense expenditures are crowding out public investment, creating growing inequality and straining social cohesion. Economists warn that if current tensions persist into 2027, the cumulative economic damage could slow growth across the Middle East by several percentage points, with knock-on effects for international trade and global markets. The key question is whether this trajectory is reversible. Trump's statement that talks are very good provides a veneer of hope, but the operational reality, missile site reconstruction, forward military deployments, and active uranium enrichment, signals that the clock is ticking. Global actors from U.S. allies to regional powers like Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE are actively preparing contingency plans. That preparation includes potential preemptive strikes, missile defense expansion, and civilian evacuation planning, reflecting the deep mistrust that no optimistic statement alone can erase. The stakes are stark. Continued tension threatens energy stability, economic growth, human welfare, and regional security. Every day that enrichment, missile readiness, and partial inspection continue in tandem increases the risk of miscalculation or direct confrontation. The choice is not theoretical, it is urgent, tangible, and immediate. The world is not watching a distant possibility, it is witnessing the near-future consequences of cumulative missteps, strategic rigidity, and political calculation. The question isn't whether this will get worse, it's how long the global community and regional populations will tolerate the gap between diplomacy and reality. Do leaders have the foresight to bridge that gap, or are we already on the precipice of escalation where talk of very good negotiations is too little, too late? The answer will shape not only the Middle East, but global stability for decades to come.